opens a central pathway, aiming for queenside expansion and potential central dominance. Developing the knight to a natural outpost, this move immediately contests central squares and prepares for pawn expansion or further piece development, setting the stage for dynamic play. Developing a knight here secures the center and prepares for castling, setting a solid foundation for future play. Opening the diagonal for the dark-squared bishop, this solidifies the center, anticipating development and potential queenside maneuvering. Building a fianchetto setup allows for a broad diagonal sweep, potentially pressuring black's kingside. This fianchetto preparation opens diagonal lines for the bishop, aiming for queenside counterplay and a solid pawn structure. Positioning the bishop on g2 solidifies control of the long diagonal and prepares for kingside castling, a classic Catalan setup. Developing the bishop to fianchetto creates a dynamic diagonal pressure, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for future kingside expansion. Securing the monarch now allows focus on the queenside expansion and potential central pressure. Solidifying the central pawn structure and preparing the fianchettoed bishop to exert influence over the queenside diagonal. Solidifying the queenside and preparing to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal are the aims here, but it does concede some central influence and slightly hinders the development of the queen's knight. Developing the knight to its natural square, d7, supports the central pawn's stability and prepares for potential king's Indian attack counterplay by clearing the way for a c5 push. Solidifying the queenside pawn chain, the bishop now eyes the long diagonal, aiming to control central squares and pressure black's developing queenside knight. Securing the kingside from potential knight or bishop invasions, this quiet pawn advance subtly prepares for future pawn pushes like g5 or f5, while also preventing immediate backrank threats. Fortifying the knight on d2 opens avenues for both the c-pawn and the queen, potentially preparing to exert pressure along the c-file or reinforce the center. This move signals a commitment to a flexible, positional approach, aiming for gradual development rather than immediate confrontation. Observe how this repositioning might influence the dynamic on the queenside in the coming turns. Launching an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, black immediately contests white's spatial advantage and aims to disrupt white's harmonious setup by pushing the g-pawn, potentially creating an outpost or forcing a weakness in white's pawn structure. Preparing a central advance, the rook now stands ready to bolster the e-file, eyeing potential breakthroughs and aiming to coordinate with its queen for future queenside expansion. Gaining a foothold on the kingside becomes paramount as black repositions the bishop to solidify its influence along the long diagonal. Challenging the central pawn chain directly opens up aggressive possibilities, but it also potentially weakens the king's defenses if black can generate counterplay on the kingside. Emboldened by the pawn thrust, black pivots the rook to defend against potential queenside pressure and prepare for a potential rook lift, aiming to secure the file for future operations. Unleashing a pawn thrust like this dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating immediate tension in the center and potentially opening lines for your pieces, especially the rook on e1, while simultaneously restricting black's dark-squared bishop. Opening the e-file demands immediate calculation. By accepting the pawn, black decisively ends the central tension, embracing a more open game where piece activity and open lines become paramount, but also risking early exposure if white's knights and queen can exploit the newly created pathways towards the kingside. Opening the d-file now presents a direct challenge to black's centralized pawn structure and creates immediate pressure along that important avenue, forcing a decision regarding its defense and potentially exposing weaknesses that can be exploited. The knight boldly advances, injecting immediate life into the queenside's potential for counterplay and challenging white's central grip by threatening to displace the key e5 pawn, aiming to unlock new avenues of attack. Unleashing the knight to the central crossroads, white initiates a strategic repositioning, aiming to either dominate the d5 square or provoke weaknesses in black's pawn structure. This dynamic redirection of force subtly shifts the battlefield's focus, preparing for a potential kingside advance or a more measured queenside development. The centralized knight now eyes crucial squares and offers increased flexibility for white's upcoming maneuvers, potentially restricting black's piece activity and forcing difficult decisions about pawn advancements. Castling consolidates the king's position, a wise precaution given white's pawn advances and the pressure building on the king side. This secures a vital safe haven before any potential tactical fireworks ignite. Seeking to disrupt black's central aspirations, white immediately contests the d6 pawn, initiating a critical battle for control over the queenside and potentially opening lines against the castled king. Relinquishing the central outposts to white's advancing pawns, black reconfigures the knight, aiming to solidify its position behind the pawn shield and prepare for future defensive maneuvering. Unleashing an aggressive pawn thrust on the king side, white aims to shatter black's defensive shell and expose the monarch. This bold maneuver intensifies the central struggle and forces black to confront immediate tactical realities. The advance of the f-pawn creates new lines of attack and promises a dynamic, potentially decisive, clash. Swapping off that well-placed bishop simplifies the position for black, but it also hands white the bishop pair and a potential initiative on the king side, while leaving black's queenside structure a little passive. The king abandons its protective pawn shield, initiating a bold foray into the advancing enemy structure that could either unleash devastating counterplay or leave the monarch perilously exposed on the open chessboard. Initiating a pawn storm on the king side is a bold gambit, sacrificing central pawn structure for potential attacking momentum, hoping to pry open lines against the white king. Liberating the kingside pawn majority now dramatically alters the central pawn structure, creating a potential pathway for the white rook to penetrate the weakened queenside should black falter in their defensive coordination. Black seeks to disrupt white's central control and create weaknesses in the pawn chain by challenging the d4 pawn, aiming to open lines for the bishop on g7 and potentially the rook on b8. This move is a bold attempt to seize the initiative by creating dynamic imbalances, though it invites immediate tactical skirmishes and potentially weakens the dark squares around the king if not handled precisely. Initiating a fascinating tactical skirmish by threatening to disrupt black's central structure and potentially seize control of the key c7 square. This knight maneuver dynamically injects immediate conflict into the center. Instead of solidifying its central pawn structure, black opts for an intriguing maneuver, bringing the knight to a square that might seem passive at first glance but possesses a hidden potential for activity, especially concerning the weakened kingside and the open g-file. Shifting the rook to the fourth rank initiates a dual threat, aiming to pressure the vulnerable c5 pawn while simultaneously preparing to infiltrate the kingside by rerouting via g4 or h4. Sharpening the knight's outreach, this pawn thrust aims to displace white's centralized knight, disrupting its influence and potentially opening lines for counterplay on the queenside. Initiating a forceful pawn storm is often tempting, but here, the knight's repositioning to d6 crafts a potent blockade, threatening to suffocate black's queenside initiative and potentially isolating that advanced c5 pawn. Introducing immediate tension to the kingside, black ventures f5, a bold attempt to destabilize white's advanced knight and reclaim some central initiative. This pawn push creates a fascinating pawn structure, promising dynamic play but also potentially exposing black's monarch to future attacks if not handled with precision. The decision to advance f5, rather than reinforcing the center or developing passively, signals an aggressive intent to seize the initiative and challenge white's seemingly solid position. It's a strategic gamble that could lead to either a spectacular counterattack or a positional unraveling, depending on how white responds to this daring territorial claim. Unleashing the powerful bishop on g2, this capture cracks open the kingside and directly challenges black's pawn chain, aiming to disrupt any nascent coordination between the queen and knight. The knight, now securely positioned on f6, finally finds a more active role, challenging the enemy's central pawn and preparing to reinforce the kingside defense. Unleashing the bishop to eliminate the knight creates immediate pressure on the pinned pawn, and opens a clear path for the rook to exploit the now weakened kingside. The queen reclaims a vital central post, aiming to support the pawn chain and exploit the weakened kingside by linking up with the remaining bishop, creating a formidable attacking force that probes white's increasingly fragile central structure. Bringing the rook to the center files, white aims to contest the open c-file and coordinate their pieces for a potential assault on black's somewhat exposed king. The g6 knight is now a tempting target, and this rook lift might be preparing to transfer pressure. A desperate gambit is unleashed, seizing the initiative with a check. Black seeks to disrupt white's centralized knight and expose the king by sacrificing material. The question is whether this knight sacrifice will truly unlock attacking chances or simply leave black down material with no compensation. White must now navigate the immediate threat and decide if a defensive posture or a sharp counterattack is the superior response to this aggressive thrust. The focus shifts dramatically to the king's safety and the potential for tactical fireworks. The white king steps out of the immediate storm, seeking refuge on the first rank, a crucial repositioning amidst the escalating tactical chaos. This maneuver introduces a fascinating fork, threatening both the queen and rook simultaneously and forcing a sharp reevaluation of white's rook placement. Refocusing the rooks to the central files aims to bolster the defense of the kingside and contest the open e-file. Seizing the opportunity, black removes white's last advanced knight, liberating the c-file and disrupting white's coordination, though it momentarily isolates the queen on d3. A bold reclamation of central space, this queen deployment aims to exploit the exposed black king and leverage the open files, though it concurrently leaves the knight on d3 momentarily vulnerable to a tactical skirmish. Initiating a spirited counterthrust along the d-file, black aims to disrupt white's centralized rook and reclaim some initiative. Re-establishing a knight on its advanced outpost, this piece now acts as a formidable blockade against black's central pawn majority, simultaneously offering defensive support to the d-pawn and a potential springboard for future operations towards the kingside. The queen boldly ventures into the heart of white's position, seeking to disrupt the king's nascent safety and potentially exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure, all while keeping a watchful eye on the now doubled f-pawns. The rook lunges aggressively, aiming to pry open the kingside and exploit the exposed g-file, injecting immediate dynamism into an otherwise blocked position by targeting a vulnerable pawn. The black knight's sudden descent to the f4 square is a bold attempt to disrupt white's attacking rhythm, directly threatening the rook on e2 and indirectly aiming to pry open the kingside. This daring maneuver injects a dynamic, albeit risky, element into the position, forcing white to immediately address the immediate pressure. Unlocking a crucial diagonal, the queen's maneuver eyes the exposed king and aims to disrupt black's increasingly compact pawn structure, potentially creating long-term weaknesses that white can exploit by leveraging the open files. This maneuver by black aims to activate the rook on the f-file, challenging white's control and preparing for potential exchanges that could simplify the position. The rook, now on a more central file, eyes the weaknesses around white's king and seeks to increase pressure. Opening a diagonal for the queen to potentially influence the kingside skirmish. Unleashing a powerful rook onto the second rank, black aims to exploit the weakened e-file and penetrate white's position, potentially targeting the king or creating new avenues for attack. A stunning gambit emerges from a seemingly calm position, offering a queen sacrifice to expose the enemy king and initiate a decisive attack. A desperate attempt to shield the monarch, but the king's precarious position on the g-file and the exposed dark squares surrounding it remain the primary vulnerability, leaving black facing significant attacking prospects for white. The queen's repositioning here immediately challenges the unprotected rook on f2 and seeks to liberate white's beleaguered king, hinting at a potential simplification into a more manageable, albeit still complex, endgame. A dramatic exchange on the queen's diagonal, relinquishing the powerful attacking queen for material parity in an endgame. This decision dramatically shifts the complexion of the game, moving away from the sharp tactical melee towards a more strategic battleground where pawn structure and piece activity will be paramount. The kings, though seemingly safe behind their respective pawn shields, will find themselves increasingly exposed as the remaining pieces are tidied up. The initiative white enjoyed on the king side has been neutralized, but the open files and potential for piece infiltration now present a new set of challenges for black. The unleashed central pawns now present a serious dilemma for black's scattered pieces. The exchange of rooks is a pivotal endgame decision, but the immediate consequence for black's king is startling exposure with the loss of its protective pawn structure. Seizing the immediate opportunity, white's monarch steps into the fray, not merely as a target, but as a dynamic participant aiming to solidify the central pawn structure and potentially launch a counteroffensive on the now exposed kingside. The rook's journey to the open d-file marks a pivotal transition, aiming to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially reactivate the isolated d5 pawn.